Her family didn't get lost. They left on purpose. 22 years old, alone in a mountain pass with a bad hip, no horse, and a blizzard 3 hours out, Evelyn Hart stood in the snow and watched the wagon tracks speed away from her. Not slow, not hesitating, fast. The kind of fast that means someone made a decision and didn't want to be talked out of it. They sent her for firewood. They knew she'd be slow. They planned it. If you've ever been thrown away by the people who were supposed to love you most, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The storm came in fast, the way the worst ones always do in the Cascade Range. Not gradually, not with much warning, just a hard shift in the wind and then the sky going the color of dirty iron from one horizon to the other. Evelyn Hart felt it before she saw it. She'd been moving through the tree line for maybe 20 minutes, breaking dead branches from the lower boughs of a cluster of Douglas firs, stuffing them into the canvas sling she carried over one shoulder. The cold had already worked its way through her wool coat and into the muscles along her left side, which always stiffened first. The hip that had never healed right after the wagon accident 2 summers back, the one her stepmother called her bad side, the same way you'd refer to a broken tool, had started to drag and ache the way it did when weather changed. She stopped, looked up through the branches. The light was wrong. Too dim for mid-afternoon, and yellowing at the edges, which meant precipitation. Evelyn had grown up watching weather move across open country, had learned to read it the way other girls learned to read scripture. That sky meant snow, and not the gentle kind. That sky meant get inside. She turned around and started back toward the wagon. The canvas sling was only half full. Maybe 20 pounds of wood, not nearly enough for a night this cold, certainly not enough for what that sky was promising. Her stepmother, Margaret, had been explicit that morning. Fill it completely. Don't come back with less than a full load. We can't afford to waste a stop. Evelyn had learned not to argue with Margaret about firewood, or about much of anything. She moved as quickly as her hip allowed, which wasn't very. The ground was uneven here, rocky beneath a thin skin of old snow, and every 4th or 5th step the bad leg wanted to give. She used a stick she'd picked up earlier as a walking staff, jabbing it into the frozen ground to stabilize herself, moving in the lurching, asymmetrical rhythm she'd long since stopped being embarrassed about. Embarrassment was a luxury. Getting back to camp was a necessity. She emerged from the tree line into the clearing where they'd stopped. The clearing where the wagon had been. The wagon wasn't there. For a moment, Evelyn just stood and looked at the empty space the way you look at something that doesn't make sense yet. The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 60 feet across, with dead grass pressed flat by early frost. There were ruts in the ground where the wheels had sat. There was a shallow depression where their mule, Old Bessie, had stood for most of the morning. There were boot prints, many of them. Her stepbrothers, her stepmother, her father's distinctive wide-heeled tread. And there was a single set of smaller prints, her own, leading away from the camp and into the trees. The wagon was not there. "Papa?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. She cleared her throat and tried again, louder. "Papa?" Nothing. Just wind moving through the pass and the distant creak of fears. Evelyn walked to the center of the clearing. The ruts in the ground told the story plainly enough once she made herself look at them. The wagon had been turned. The tracks showed the mule backing up, repositioning, and then it had moved, east, further into the pass, not back the way they'd come. She stood there holding her half-full sling of firewood and looked at those tracks moving away from her. She told herself there was an explanation. Maybe the storm had spooked the mule, and her father had needed to move to keep it calm. Maybe something had happened further ahead and they'd gone to investigate. Maybe one of the boys, Thomas or Cole, had gotten hurt and they'd had to push forward to find shelter. She told herself all of this while her eyes moved slowly over the tracks on the ground. The thing about tracks in soft snow and frozen mud is that they don't lie. They show you speed, they show you direction, they show you intention. And those tracks, her family's tracks, her father's wagon, everything she owned in the world, those tracks were moving away from her at a pace that wasn't panicked, wasn't rushed by a spooked animal. The wheel furrows were deep and even. The gait of the mule's hooves was controlled. They had walked away from her, deliberately, at a measured pace. Evelyn sat down in the snow. She didn't cry. Not yet. She sat on the frozen ground in the middle of that empty clearing and looked at the tracks leading east, and for a long time she didn't do anything at all. The wind picked up. The first few flakes of snow began to come down, fat, lazy ones that meant more behind them. The stick she'd been using as a walking staff lay across her knees. She thought about her father. Caleb Hart was not a cruel man. She'd always told herself that. He was weak, maybe, the kind of man who went quiet when Margaret spoke and went along with whatever she decided because going along was easier than arguing. But he wasn't cruel. He loved Evelyn. She'd always believed that. He'd held her hand when her mother died. He'd sat with her through the long fever of that first winter without her. He'd told her, many times, in his quiet way, that she was the image of her mother and that he was grateful she was his. She looked at those tracks. She thought about the night, 3 weeks ago, when she'd heard Margaret and her father talking by the fire. She hadn't been meant to hear it. She'd been half asleep in the back of the wagon, wrapped in blankets, and their voices had carried on the still air. The girl can't make it through the pass, Caleb, not with that leg. She'll slow us down and we'll all die trying to carry her. She's my daughter. She's a liability. You know it as well as I do. We've got 3 children to think about. A long silence. Then her father's voice, low and tired. I'll think about it. Evelyn had told herself she'd misunderstood. She'd convinced herself it was just Margaret being harsh, the way Margaret was always harsh, and that her father would never... that there were some things a person simply didn't do. She looked at the tracks. She had not misunderstood. She spent the first night under a deadfall spruce at the edge of the tree line. Getting there had taken most of what remained of the daylight, and by the time she'd crawled beneath the low-hanging branches with her bundle of firewood and her one good flint, her teeth were knocking together, and the hip had gone from aching to a deep, grinding wrongness that she'd learned to breathe through when nothing else was possible. She built a fire about the size of her 2 fists. That was all she could afford. Fires make light, and light can be seen, and she had no way of knowing who else moved through this pass in November. She ate the last of the food she had on her, half a biscuit from breakfast, so hard it nearly cracked a tooth, and a small piece of dried venison she found at the bottom of her coat pocket, which she chewed slowly and carefully, making it last. It wasn't enough. It was nowhere near enough. She thought about her situation the way she imagined a person ought to think about their situation when they were in one like this. Practically, without panic, taking inventory. What did she have? 1 wool coat, worn but intact. Boots that were good leather, slightly too big. Wool stockings. A canvas sling that could serve as a bag. 20 pounds of firewood, which would last maybe 2 nights if she was conservative. A flint striker. A small folding knife she kept in her coat pocket. She'd had it since she was 14 and had never once thought she'd need it for anything more serious than cutting rope. A tin cup. No food, no water, except what she could melt from snow. What did she need? To get out of these mountains before the big snow came. She looked up at the sky between the spruce branches. The clouds were low and moving fast, and they had that heavy, loaded look that the worst storms carried. She thought she probably had a day, maybe 2 if she was lucky, and she had not been especially lucky lately. In the morning, she decided she would follow the wagon tracks east, not because she expected her family to come back for her. She had already stopped expecting that, but because east was the way out of the pass. There might be a settlement at the other end. There might be trappers, travelers, someone, or there might not be. She fed the last of the big pieces of wood into the tiny fire and pulled her knees to her chest and waited for morning. She didn't sleep much. The cold wouldn't let her go deep enough. She kept surfacing to feed the fire or to shift position when the hip went from discomfort to something that felt almost like a scream. And each time she surfaced, she was aware of how dark it was and how far away from anything human she was and how truly alone she'd become. She thought about Thomas, who was 16 and had her same dark hair, and who had taught her to whistle, and who had watched her walk away toward the trees that morning with an expression she hadn't been able to read. She thought about Cole, who was 13 and mean in the particular way of boys who'd learned meanness from their mother and didn't know yet that they'd have to unlearn it later. She thought about Margaret, about the precise set of her jaw and the way she'd looked at Evelyn's bad leg with the calculating expression of someone adding up costs. She thought about her father. She didn't let herself cry because crying cost water and warmth, and she couldn't afford to spend either. The tracks had been mostly covered by new snow by the time she started east in the morning, but she could still make out the faint depression where the wheels had cut through. She followed it as best she could, moving slowly, stopping often to rest the hip. By midday, she'd been forced to discard the firewood. It was too heavy, and her hands were going numb trying to grip the sling, and the loss of it felt like losing the last thing she had. The snow was coming steadily now. Not the heavy blizzard she'd feared, not yet, but a persistent wet snow that settled into her collar and melted against her skin and then refroze when the wind picked up. Her coat was soaked through by noon. She was soaked through by early afternoon. By late afternoon, she wasn't sure she was still following the tracks or if she'd drifted off into the trees somewhere. She stopped in a small clearing and tried to get her bearings. East was still east. The mountains were still above her. The pass still had to have an end somewhere, but her body was giving up its heat in a way she'd heard described once by an old mountain man who'd come through her father's trading post in Kansas 3 years ago. "You stop shivering when you're really in trouble," he'd said. "Shivering is your body fighting. When it stops, you've run out of fight." She was still shivering, barely. She started walking again. By the time the light was failing for the second day, she knew she wasn't going to make it out of the mountains. She understood this the way you understand things when you're past the point of panic, clearly, without emotion, like reading a map. The distance was too great. The cold was too deep. Her leg had gone from dragging to something closer to buckling every few steps. She'd fallen twice in the last hour. The second fall had taken several long minutes to recover from. The third fall, she thought, might be the last. She'd drunk snowmelt when she could and eaten exactly nothing since the night before, and the hunger had moved past the stomach-gnawing stage into something quieter and more dangerous. Her thoughts were slowing down. That was the worst of it. She'd always had quick, sharp thoughts, had prided herself on it. Her mother had called her her little hawk, always watching, always turning things over, but her thoughts now were sluggish and kept circling back to nothing. She found a hollow between two large boulders, out of the wind, and sat down against the cold stone. She wasn't going to light a fire. She had no wood, and even if she had wood, she wasn't sure she had the fine motor control left to use the flint. Her fingers were past numb. They were past the place where she could feel them at all. She leaned her head back against the stone. She thought, "I don't want to die." She thought it with a kind of mild surprise, the way you note an interesting fact. She'd been too cold and too exhausted and too consumed with the mechanics of survival to feel much of anything for 2 days. But there it was, rising up through the fog. "I don't want to die. I'm 22 years old, and I have never been anywhere or done anything, and I don't want to die in the snow." The thought didn't lead anywhere useful. She was going to die in the snow regardless of whether she wanted to. The mountain didn't care about what she wanted. The wind had died. The snow was falling straight down now, thick and fast, and it was settling on her coat and her hair and the tops of her boots. And she was aware that if she kept sitting here, the snow would simply cover her, and in the morning she would be a white shape that looked like a small boulder. She was aware of this and could not quite make herself move. Then she heard something. It wasn't sound exactly. It was a change in the quality of the silence, the absence of something, the wind, the settling of snow, that suddenly made her aware that something in her immediate world had shifted. She opened her eyes. There was a shape above her, large, standing between her and the snow-heavy sky. She'd heard no footsteps, which meant the snow was deep enough now to muffle them, which meant she'd been sitting here longer than she'd thought. The shape resolved itself slowly into a man. He was very tall, wide across the shoulders in a way that wasn't fat, just bulk, the kind of bulk that comes from years of hard physical labor in cold weather. He wore a heavy fur coat, the kind that was clearly made rather than bought, with the skins pieced together roughly but effectively. A hat of dark beaver felt, pulled low. He had a rifle across his back and something dead hanging from his left hand. She couldn't make out what in the dim light. His face was half covered by a scarf wound twice around his lower jaw. He was looking at her. She looked back at him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he crouched down. Slowly, the way you'd crouch near something that might bolt, except she was far too frozen to bolt anywhere. And she could see his eyes. Dark. Assessing. Moving over her the way a person's eyes move over something they're trying to understand. "You alive?" His voice was low, with a roughness to it like gravel underfoot. "Yes," Evelyn said. The word came out strange, thick. Her lips weren't working right. You alone? Yes? He looked at her for another long moment. Then he looked up and around at the trees, at the clearing, at the snow falling thick and fast. Whatever he was calculating, he seemed to reach a conclusion about it. Can you walk? She tried to move her legs. The hip seized immediately and a sharp, involuntary sound came out of her. Not quite a cry, more like a punctuation mark, the kind your body makes without your permission. No, she said. He looked at her leg, then back at her face. Then, without saying anything else, he set down the thing he'd been carrying in his left hand, a fox she saw now, frozen stiff, and unslung his rifle and set that down too. He crouched and got one arm beneath her knees and one behind her back. "This'll hurt," he said, which was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in quite a long time. It did hurt. The movement of her leg sent a white-hot flare up through her hip and spine that made her vision go briefly dark at the edges. She made that sound again, the involuntary one. He didn't stop, didn't apologize, just stood up with her and retrieved the rifle and the fox in a single efficient motion that suggested he'd had practice carrying things that didn't want to cooperate. He started walking. "Where are you taking me?" she said. "Cabin." "How far?" "Far enough." She wanted to ask more questions. Who are you? What do you want? Is this better or worse than dying in the snow? But the cold had taken most of her words, and the motion of being carried was jostling the hip into a steady, brutal ache that occupied most of her remaining attention. She watched the snow fall past his hat brim. She listened to his breathing, which was steady and controlled, the breathing of a man doing hard work who'd done hard work before. The trees moved past. The world was white and gray and getting darker. She thought, at least I'm not dying in the snow. And then she thought, maybe I'm dying somewhere else. And then she thought nothing at all for a while. She came back to herself by degrees. Warmth first, a deep animal warmth that she felt in her bones before she felt it on her skin, the kind of warmth you only understand after you've been truly, dangerously cold. Then smell, wood smoke, pine resin, something animal, something that might have been coffee or might have been boiled leather. Then sound, fire, the particular close-up sound of a fire in a hearth, the pop and shift of good burning wood. Then pain. Her hip had settled into a deep volcanic throb. Her fingers and toes were doing something between tingling and burning as the blood came back to them, which she knew was good and felt terrible. She opened her eyes. The ceiling was rough-hewn timber close above her. She was lying on something, a cot or a pallet, covered with several heavy furs. The room was small enough that she could see most of it from where she lay. A stone fireplace that took up most of one wall, a rough table with 2 chairs, shelves along another wall stacked with cans and dried goods and pelts and tools and things she couldn't identify in the dim light. A single window covered with what looked like oilcloth, with gray light coming through it. A door. An iron stove with a pot on it. Various implements hanging from the ceiling beams, traps, dried herbs, a coil of rope, and a dog. It was sitting 3 feet from the cot, watching her with the steady, unblinking attention that only large dogs and very old people seem to manage. It was enormous, some kind of mix, she thought, that included a great deal of something wolf-adjacent. Pale gray fur, yellow eyes, and an expression of complete neutrality that was somehow more unnerving than aggression would have been. Evelyn and the dog looked at each other. "He won't bother you unless I tell him to." She turned her head. The man was at the fireplace, his back to her, doing something with the pot. He'd taken off the fur coat and the hat. His hair was dark with threads of gray and was longer than was fashionable, pulled back roughly at the nape of his neck. Without the coat, he was still large, broad-shouldered, long-armed, and she could see scarring on the side of his neck that disappeared into his collar. "What's his name?" she said. Her voice was still strange and thick. He looked over his shoulder at the dog. "Rack. Rack." She considered this. The dog's tail moved once, a single slow sweep, and then stopped. "That's an unusual name." "It's his name." She looked back up at the ceiling. "What's yours?" A pause, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Creed." "Is that a first name or a last name?" "Last?" "What's your first name?" Another pause. "Ronan. Ronan Creed." She turned her head to look at him again. He was ladling something into a cup. "My name is Evelyn Hart." He brought the cup over and held it out. It was some kind of broth, barely anything, mostly hot water with a faint brownish tinge and a smell that was more functional than appealing. She tried to sit up, and her hip reminded her that sitting up was currently not a casual act. He watched her struggle without offering to help. Then, when she'd gotten herself propped against the rough wall behind the cot, he held out the cup again. "Drink it slow." She took the cup in both hands. Her fingers were clumsy, not fully her own yet. The broth was thin and faintly salty, and the most welcome thing she'd tasted in as long as she could remember. She drank it slowly as instructed. "Thank you," she said. He'd already turned back to the fire. Ultek. She slept again. When she woke the second time, the light through the oilcloth was brighter, which meant morning, which meant she'd lost most of a day somewhere. The fire had been stoked. Rack was no longer at her bedside, but she could hear him, or she thought she could, a quiet shifting movement near the door. Ronan was at the table, doing something with what looked like a length of wire and a small tool. Working on a trap, she realized. His hands moved with the economical precision of someone who'd done the same task 10,000 times. She watched him for a minute. He was older than she'd first thought. Not old, but past 40, she guessed. Maybe past 45. The scarring on his neck was more visible now, and she could see there was more of it extending up behind his left ear. His face, when he turned slightly to reach for something on the table, was deeply weathered and unreadable in the way of men who'd spent a great deal of time alone. "How long was I out?" she said. He didn't look up from the trap. "Part of yesterday. All last night." "What day is it?" "Wednesday." He said it like the day of the week was a fact of limited relevance, which she supposed it was. "I need to." She gestured vaguely. He set down the trap and stood. "Door's there. Use the far corner of the porch. I'll get you there." "I can manage." "You can't." He said it without cruelty, just flatly, the way you'd state a fact about weather. "You'll fall on the steps." She wanted to argue. The hip's first movement when she shifted her weight argued back on his behalf. He helped her to the door with the brusque efficiency of someone who'd assisted injured animals before and found the process tedious but necessary. He gave her privacy. He helped her back. He didn't say anything about any of it, which she was grateful for because there was nothing less dignified than needing help with the basics of existing, and she had very little dignity left to protect. When she was back on the cot, breathing through the hip pain and trying to reassemble herself into something that didn't feel completely helpless, he went to the stove and came back with a small bowl of something that was recognizably food this time. Beans, mostly. Some dried meat mixed in. She ate it all. Over the next 2 days, Evelyn pieced together what she could about Ronan Creed. He didn't offer information voluntarily. He didn't offer much of anything voluntarily. But she was conscious and observant and had spent most of her life in a household where she had to read between the lines of what people said and didn't say, and she watched him carefully. He was a trapper. That was clear from the pelts that hung everywhere and the traps in various states of maintenance and the smell of the place, which was heavily animal in a way that she was slowly becoming accustomed to. He ran trap lines somewhere in the mountains above. She gathered this from the small details of his comings and goings, the way he prepared before going out, the things he brought back. He was skilled. She could see that in the quality of the pelts, in the way he moved through the work with no wasted motion. He had lived alone here for a long time. The cabin had the quality of a space that had never been organized for more than one person. One chair angled toward the fire, one cup, one plate, everything at a height and placement that worked for someone of his specific size and reach. There were no photographs, no letters she could see, no personal items that pointed to anyone or anywhere else, just the work of surviving. She learned on the second day that his right knee had been damaged at some point. He didn't limp. He'd adapted past limping. But she could see the way he placed his weight getting up from a crouch, the way he descended the porch steps with his right leg doing less of the work. It wasn't recent. It was an old accommodation. She did not ask about the scars. On the third day, she tried to get up on her own to reach something on the shelf. She made it to standing, crossed the 6 feet to the shelf, and was reaching for the tin cup she'd been using when the hip simply stopped working mid-movement and she went down hard. She caught herself on the edge of the shelf, which was not secured to the wall as well as it might have been, and shelf and tin cup and several other items came down with her in a clatter. She sat on the floor, surrounded by the debris, and waited for the hip pain to subside to something manageable. Ronan appeared in the doorway from outside, rifle in hand, taking in the scene. She looked up at him. "I'm fine." He looked at her. He looked at the shelf and the scattered items. He looked back at her. "You're not fine," he said. "I'm sitting on the floor voluntarily. It's a floor meditation, very fashionable back east." He put the rifle against the wall. He collected the items from the floor and replaced the shelf, which he secured with 2 additional nails. He picked up the tin cup and set it on the table. Then he held out his hand. She took it, and he pulled her upright in a single smooth motion. "Don't do that again," he said. "Try to get my own cup?" Fall. She wanted to say I didn't exactly plan it, but he'd already moved away and she thought she understood what he meant. Not a scolding, a practical concern. He'd dragged her out of the snow, which meant he'd invested time and effort in keeping her alive, and her falling on the floor was a threat to that investment. She wasn't a person to him yet. She was a responsibility he'd acquired. She sat back down on the cot and looked at the floor where she'd been and thought, "That's fine. That's the same as I've always been to everyone." But it wasn't entirely true, and she knew it. He'd carried her out of a blizzard. He hadn't had to do that. On the 4th day, her hip was functional enough to move around the cabin carefully, and she had enough of herself back together to start thinking practically. She needed to figure out what her situation actually was. She waited until evening, when Ronan had come back from his trapline and was eating at the table. She'd been awake and restless all day, turning the question over, and now she sat down in the other chair, the one she'd noticed him look at briefly when she moved it. The look a person gives a piece of furniture that's been in a certain place so long its position has become a fact. And she said, "I need to understand what this is." He looked at her over his bowl. He had a way of looking at people that was very direct and very empty of anything she could read, which she found unsettling and suspected he'd cultivated. What is?" he said. "This. Me being here. What you expect. What the terms are." He set down his spoon. "Terms. You found me. You brought me here. You've been feeding me. I assume that doesn't come without expectations." Something moved across his face. Not offense. She didn't think he was the kind of man who took easy offense, but something more like recognition. "What kind of expectations are you worried about?" he said. "The obvious kind." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "No, you don't have them, or no, you won't act on them." "No to both." He picked up his spoon again. "You're in no shape and you can't get out of the mountains until spring. I'm not going to add to your trouble." She studied his face. He was still eating, which she thought meant he'd said what he meant and didn't feel the need to elaborate. "All right," she said. "Then what do you need from me? Because I can't just sit on that cot and eat your food and not contribute anything. I won't do that." He looked at her for a moment. "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Can you mend?" "Yes." "Can you stay out of my way when I'm working?" "That depends on how much space you need." The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the facial equivalent of someone making a note. "That's the deal then," he said. "You cook and mend and keep the fire. I hunt and run the lines and keep the cabin standing. And in spring?" "In spring you leave." She nodded. "All right." He went back to eating. She watched him for a moment. "My family left me," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way things do sometimes when they've been held too long. "In the past, they sent me for firewood and they left while I was gone, my father and my stepmother and my 2 stepbrothers. They just left." He didn't say anything. He also didn't look away, which she appreciated. People usually looked away. "I saw the tracks," she said. "They didn't panic. They didn't get swept away by the mule. They made a choice." Silence. "I'm telling you because I need you to know I'm not going to do anything stupid like try to go after them or—" She stopped. "I just needed to say it to someone. I haven't said it out loud yet." Ronan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Eat something." She blinked. He nodded toward the stove. "There's more in the pot. You haven't eaten enough today." It wasn't sympathy exactly. It was something more basic than sympathy. Something that meant you're alive and that has to keep going. And she found to her mild surprise that it was enough. She got up and got more food from the pot. Her hip held. She sat back down and ate. Outside, the storm had found them again, and the wind threw snow against the oilcloth window and made the fire lean in the hearth. But inside, the fire held. The cabin was small and rough and smelled like traps and dog and wood smoke. She ate. She was alive. For now, that was the whole of it. The first full week in the cabin nearly broke her in a different way than the cold had. Physical survival had its own logics: keep warm, keep fed, keep moving. That she understood. What she hadn't anticipated was the particular difficulty of existing in close quarters with a man who communicated primarily through silence and expected you to figure out the rest on your own. Ronan Creed did not explain himself. He did not explain his routines, his expectations, his moods, or his reasons for doing things in precisely the way he did them. He simply did them, in the same order, at roughly the same times, and if you were in the way, you learned quickly to not be in the way. He woke before light. She knew this because she'd wake to the sound of the fire being stoked and the soft sound of Rack's nails on the floor as the dog followed him to the door. By the time the light came through the oilcloth window, Ronan was already gone. Out on the trap lines, she assumed, based on what he came back with and what he didn't come back with. He returned by mid-afternoon, sometimes earlier if the weather was bad, and he'd spend the remaining light working in the cabin or on the small porch, repairing equipment, processing whatever the traps had yielded, doing the 1,000 maintenance tasks that keeping a remote cabin functional apparently required. He ate twice a day. He spoke rarely. He moved through the cabin like a man who'd spent so long alone that he'd stopped imagining he might need to accommodate another person's presence. Evelyn watched him and took note of all of it and started carefully to make herself useful. The first morning she was mobile enough to stand at the stove for any length of time. She made a proper breakfast. Not much, because there wasn't much to work with. But she found cornmeal and salt and rendered fat, and she made hoe cakes on the iron griddle that had been sitting unused on the shelf. When Ronan came back from checking a trap near the cabin, she'd heard him moving around outside. He came in and stopped when he smelled food that wasn't broth. He looked at the plate she'd set on the table. He looked at her. "Sit," she said. "They're going to get cold." He sat. He ate 3 of them without saying anything. Then he said, "There's molasses in the tin on the second shelf." "I saw it. I wasn't sure if you were saving it." "Not for anything particular." She got the molasses. He poured some over the remaining hoe cake and ate it. She sat across from him with her own plate and ate, and didn't try to make conversation, because she'd already learned that conversation with Ronan Creed was not something you could force into existence. It either happened or it didn't. That morning, it didn't. But the hoe cakes were gone, every one of them, and when he went back out, he didn't say thank you, but he also didn't say don't bother, which she decided to count as the same thing. She spent that morning taking inventory of the cabin's food stores in a systematic way, making mental notes because there was no paper she could find, and she didn't want to ask for any yet. What she found was not encouraging. There was dried meat, venison, and something else, rabbit maybe, and canned goods that were mostly beans and tomatoes, and cornmeal and a small amount of flour, and some dried apples that had gone a bit leathery. Salt, which was more important than it sounded. Coffee, barely enough. Rendered fat. Honey instead of sugar, 1 small jar. A little rice. A very little rice. She thought about the weeks of winter still ahead. She thought about 2 people eating instead of 1. She did the arithmetic in her head, and it didn't produce comfortable results. When Ronan came back that afternoon with a brace of rabbits, she'd heard him checking on the north side of the cabin. She didn't say anything about the arithmetic. But that evening, when she made stew with one of the rabbits and stretched it further than it wanted to go with the beans, she made sure every piece of the meat was used and the bones went back into the pot for broth. He noticed. She could tell by the way he looked at the pot, then at her, the calculating look he got when he was adding something up. He didn't say anything. He ate. She was beginning to understand that with Ronan, eating what you made was the compliment. The harder adjustment was the physical space of the cabin itself. It was built for 1 person, and it accommodated 2 with the grudging tolerance of a too small coat. There was the cot she was sleeping on, which was his. She'd figured that out when she saw him making a pallet on the floor near the fire without any comment about it, and she'd immediately said he should take the cot back, and he'd said he slept better on the floor, and she'd known that was probably not true, but also known there was no argument to be had. There was the table with 2 chairs, which was now used by 2 people as it was designed for. And there was everything else: the stove, the shelves, the work areas, which were distributed in a spatial logic that made sense for one person moving through a rehearsed routine and made much less sense for two people trying to occupy the same room without constantly being in each other's path. They walked into each other 3 times in the first week. Not dramatically, just the mundane collision of two people learning the shape of sharing space. The first time she was crossing from the stove and he was moving to the shelf and they met in the middle with a jar of salt between them and she stepped back onto his foot. "Sorry," she said. He didn't say anything, just moved around her. The second time was worse. She'd been reaching for the water bucket and he came in from outside suddenly, the door catching wind and swinging hard, and the surprise of it made her spin around and the bad hip gave its opinion on spinning around abruptly, and she went down on one knee with a sound she hated making. He was there before she'd finished going down, one hand gripping her upper arm, taking her weight. She steadied. He let go, stepped back, like touching her was something he'd done on instinct and wasn't sure about now. "I'm fine," she said. She said it before he could look at her leg with that calculating expression. "You twisted it." "I didn't twist it. I stumbled. It's different." It didn't sound different. She took a breath and stood up straight and looked at him levelly. He was maybe 3 feet away, and in the interior of the cabin, he seemed even larger than he had in the snow, filling up more of the room just by being in it. "I have a bad hip," she said. "It's not going to get better. It's just the way it is. I'd appreciate it if you'd stop monitoring it like it's going to suddenly become your problem." Something shifted in his expression. Not irritation exactly, more like he was revising something he'd assumed. "It's already my problem if you fall and can't work," he said. That was such an honest and purely practical response that she almost laughed. Almost. "Fair point," she said. "I'll be more careful." She was more careful. She also started moving differently through the cabin, making wider turns, keeping one hand available to catch a shelf or the table edge, being conscious of where her feet were relative to the floor. It wasn't new, exactly. She'd been managing the hip her whole adult life. It was more that she'd slipped into carelessness during the worst days of her survival in the snow, when she'd been pushing through pain rather than working with it, and now she had to relearn the careful management of it. Ronan, for his part, started doing something she didn't notice for several days. He started rearranging things, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but she'd reach for a pot and find it had been moved to the lower shelf. Or she'd go to pull water and find the bucket had been relocated to a spot she could reach without the awkward stretch that had caused the stumble. Small adjustments, done without comment, that made moving through the cabin slightly less of a negotiation with her own limitations. She thought about saying something about it. She decided not to. Acknowledgement might make him stop. The third collision was her fault, entirely, and she knew it. She'd been trying to mend his second coat. He had 2, a heavier outer one for the worst cold and a lighter working coat for everything else. And the lighter one had a long tear along the back seam that had been patched badly before and was pulling open again. She'd found a needle and thread in his kit and set to work, and she'd been so focused on the stitching that she hadn't heard him come back in from outside. And when he put his hand on the coat to take it from the hook she was reaching for simultaneously, they were suddenly occupying about 6 inches of the same space. She felt the warmth of him before she registered he was there. He smelled like cold and pine and wood smoke and something else she couldn't name. She stepped back quickly, coat in hand, and he stepped back too, and there was a half second where they were both recalibrating. "I was mending it," she said. "The back seam. It was going to go completely if it wasn't fixed." He looked at the coat in her hands, then at her. "You don't have to do that." "I know. I wanted to." She paused. "The stitching that was there before was wrong for the stress point on that seam. It'll hold better if it's done differently." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you know about stitching seams?" "My mother was a seamstress." She turned the coat slightly to show him where she'd already reworked the first 6 inches of the tear. "She taught me everything she knew. I'm probably the best seamstress within 50 miles of wherever we are right now." The corner of his mouth did the thing, the not-quite smile. "Probably," he said. She sat back down and continued mending. He moved around her to the stove. She listened to him pour coffee and thought about how that was the most she'd made him say since the day they'd negotiated the arrangement. Small victories, she thought. You counted them. The days settled into a rhythm that wasn't comfortable exactly, but was functional. Evelyn cooked, and she cooked well, which was perhaps the most useful thing about her in this situation, because she had a talent for making limited ingredients produce more than they seemed to contain. She'd grown up doing it in the trading post kitchen when money was tight, which it usually was, and she understood the arithmetic of food the way some people understood numbers on a page. She stretched the dried meat into soups, used the fat and the cornmeal and the dried apples in combinations that produced something more than the sum of their parts, rationed the coffee with the discipline of someone who understood it was not going to be replenished any time soon. She mended everything that needed mending. There was a great deal that needed mending. Ronan had been managing his clothing with the pragmatic approach of a man who patched things just enough to keep them functional and no further. Sleeves missing buttons, a pair of heavy wool trousers with a knee that had been darned so many times the darn was itself unraveling, boot liners that had been sewn back together with what appeared to be rawhide cord, which worked but was terrible for warmth. She worked through it systematically, and each morning when he dressed she could see him register, briefly and without expression, that something was different about how his clothing fit or functioned. He didn't say thank you. She hadn't expected him to. She kept the fire in the stove going, which was more work than it sounded. Wood had to be brought in from the pile on the porch, and the pile had to be managed so the wettest pieces were rotated to dry before they were needed. The fire had its own temperament, depending on the wood and the wind and the draft in the chimney, and keeping it at the right level was part skill and part constant attention. She learned it. She did not go outside alone. This was not a rule Ronan had stated. He hadn't stated much. But she understood it implicitly. The snow beyond the cabin door was serious, and the terrain beyond the cabin's small clearing was territory she didn't know and couldn't navigate safely on her bad leg. And she was honest enough with herself to accept this, even though the confinement wore on her in ways she didn't like admitting. She'd always been someone who needed to move, to see what was around the next thing, to be going somewhere. Stillness had never agreed with her. The four walls of the cabin, however necessary, pressed in. Rack helped, in his odd, non-demonstrative way. The dog had decided sometime in the second week that Evelyn was an acceptable presence, and he expressed this by shifting his sleeping spot from near the door to somewhere between the door and the cot, which put him roughly in her orbit. He didn't invite petting exactly, but he didn't discourage it either, and she found herself talking to him in the afternoons when Ronan was out. Not saying anything particular, just talking, because the silence of the cabin on her own was a different kind of silence than the silence when Ronan was in it, and she needed to hear a voice even if it was her own. One afternoon, in the middle of her one-sided conversation with Rack about what she imagined the mountains looked like in summer, the dog's head came up and swiveled toward the door, and then Ronan's boots hit the porch steps 2 minutes before she'd expected him. She stopped mid-sentence. Rack's tail moved once. Ronan came in, stamped snow from his boots, and hung his coat. He glanced at Rack, then at Evelyn. He'd clearly heard the tail end of something, though what, she couldn't know. "Talking to the dog," she said, before he could ask or not ask. "He won't answer. He's a good listener." Ronan hung his hat. "He listens when he wants to. Rest of the time he's thinking about rabbits." She looked at the dog, who had returned to his neutral expression. "I don't blame him." Something in the air of the cabin shifted slightly when he said that. A fraction less weight. Something that might have been the closest thing to ease she'd felt in the weeks since she'd arrived. She filed it away and didn't push it. But she thought about it later, when the fire had burned low and Ronan was on his pallet, and the dark of the cabin was interrupted only by the dim orange glow of the coals. She thought about how strange it was, what survival could do to two people, how it could put a wall up, and then slowly, without either person deciding it, the wall could develop something like a door. Not open. Not yet. Just a door. The possibility of opening. She didn't know what to do with that. She also didn't know how to stop herself from noticing things about him that were not strictly relevant to survival. The way his hands moved when he worked, with a kind of precision that she associated with people who'd learned their skills slowly and from necessity rather than instruction. The way he sat with his bad knee extended at a slight angle, a habit so ingrained he probably didn't know he was doing it. The scar that disappeared into his collar, and the one she'd noticed at the corner of his left eyebrow, and the fact that his nose had been broken at least once and had healed slightly off-center, which gave his face an asymmetry that somehow made it more interesting rather than less. She noticed these things the way she noticed the cabin inventory, practically, thoroughly, without judgment. That was what she told herself. The hard conversations happened slowly, in pieces, the way conversations with guarded people always do. Nothing straight on, everything at an angle. She learned that he'd come to the mountains 11 years ago and hadn't been east of them since. She learned this not because he said I came here 11 years ago, but because of a reference he made to a winter that she placed, and she counted back. She learned that he'd built the cabin himself, or most of it, which explained its particular combination of solid construction and rough finishing. The bones were good, and the details were an afterthought. She learned that Rack was 5 years old, and that there had been a previous dog before him, which Ronan mentioned once and then didn't mention again, and she understood from the way he said it that the previous dog's death was the kind of loss that doesn't get smaller. She didn't push for more than what came. She'd learned early that pushing with Ronan produced not more information but less. He'd go quieter, pull further back, and the door she'd imagined would go back to being a wall. What she didn't learn, and didn't ask about, was what had brought him here and kept him here. The scar, the isolation, the 11 years without going east. All of it pointed to a story she could feel the shape of without being able to see it directly, and she knew better than to grab for it. Some things a person gives when they're ready, and not before. What she gave him, in return for his unwilling patience, was competence. That was the currency she had. Every meal that was better than what he'd have managed alone, every piece of clothing that came back functional instead of just patched, every evening when the fire was at the right level and the water was already boiled when he came in cold and tired. That was what she had to offer, and she offered it without comment or expectation. She didn't offer weakness or despair or the complicated grief of what her family had done to her, that she kept private mostly. It came out sometimes, in the middle of the night when the wind was particularly loud and the dark particularly complete, or on the days when the hip was bad enough that she couldn't keep up with her own expectations of herself. On those days she was shorter-tempered and less patient, and Ronan seemed to sense it without being told, giving her more space, asking less of the cabin's shared air. He was not kind, but he was not unkind. And she was starting to understand that in a person like him, that distinction mattered enormously. One evening, near the end of the second week, she was mending a pair of thick wool socks that had developed holes in both heels simultaneously, which seemed like an achievement of some kind. And Ronan was at the table with a piece of leather and a small awl, doing something to the strap of a snowshoe. The fire was good. Outside, the wind had settled for the first time in days to a low background sound rather than the howling that had been making the oilcloth windows bow. She said without looking up from the sock, "Do you ever miss it? Back east?" He didn't answer immediately. She waited. "Some things," he said. "Like what?" A pause. The awl made small, precise sounds in the leather. "Better coffee," he said finally. She snorted. She hadn't meant to. It came out before she could stop it. And then she was laughing, which she also hadn't done in what felt like a very long time. And the laugh sounded strange in the low-ceilinged cabin, too big for the room and rusty from disuse. He looked at her, not quite smiling, watching. "Sorry," she said, getting herself back under control. I wasn't expecting that answer." "What were you expecting?" "I don't know. A person, a place, something significant." "Coffee's significant," he said, "when it's good." She went back to the sock. She was smiling, and she let herself because he wasn't looking at her anymore. "Fair enough," she said. The fire settled. Rack exhaled from somewhere near the hearth. Outside, the mountain held itself in a silence that was almost peaceful, and inside the small, rough cabin, two deeply imperfect people sat in their respective silences, not close and not far. And the evening passed in a way that was not friendship yet, but was, perhaps, the raw material of it. She stitched the heel of the sock, tied off the thread, and started on the second one. Her hands were steady. The hip was quiet. The fire was good. She was still alive, and tonight, for the first time in weeks, that felt like more than just a fact. The thing about winter in the high timber was that it didn't peak and then ease the way winter did in lower country. It stacked. Each storm built on the last one, compressing the snow into a harder, denser layer that made the ground treacherous and the cold more penetrating. And by the time what Ronan called the deep winter arrived, Somewhere in the third week of December, by Evelyn's rough calculation, the world outside the cabin had become something that didn't much resemble a place people were meant to occupy. She'd adjusted to the rhythm of it, or as close to adjusted as a person could get. The days had their shape now. The early dark mornings, the long quiet hours in the cabin while Ronan ran his lines, the afternoons when he returned and the small cabin contracted around two people and one large dog trying to exist in it simultaneously. She'd learned how the stove behaved when the wind came from the north versus the east. She'd learned that Rack's ears went back slightly before Ronan's boots hit the porch, which gave her about 30 seconds of warning, which she'd discovered was useful for reasons she didn't examine too carefully. She'd also learned the particular silences of Ronan Creed. There was the working silence, which was dense and focused and not directed at her at all. There was the eating silence, which was simply a man who found conversation incompatible with food and didn't apologize for it. And there was a third kind of silence that she'd started to notice in the evenings, when the day's work was done and the fire was good and there was nothing requiring either of them. A silence that was less like absence and more like presence, like someone standing near something without knowing quite why they'd stopped walking. She didn't name it. Naming it seemed like the surest way to make it disappear. What she did instead was talk, not chatter. She wasn't a chatterer, had never been, but the slow, episodic kind of conversation that develops between two people who have run out of reasons to be guarded and haven't yet figured out what comes after that. She told him about growing up in Kansas, about her mother's seamstress shop and the smell of it, hot iron and sizing starch, and the particular sweetness of new cotton. She told him about the trading post and about how her father had loved it in a sincere but impractical way, the way some men love things they're not very good at. She told him about her mother's death, which she could do now with the flatness of a story that had been told internally so many times it had worn smooth. Ronan listened. He didn't prompt and he rarely asked questions, but she'd come to understand that wasn't disinterest. It was how he absorbed information, slowly, taking it in rather than responding in real time. Occasionally he'd reference something she'd said days later, which told her he'd been sitting with it. "You said your mother taught you to sew," he said one evening, unprovoked, while he was working a piece of rawhide into a new trap trigger. "Yes. How old were you when she started?" 5, I think, maybe 4. It was the first useful thing she taught me." She paused, remembering. She used to say that the difference between a woman who sews and a woman who just makes stitches is whether she understands what the cloth wants to do, the grain of it, the way it pulls in one direction. You have to work with it instead of fighting it. Ronan was quiet for a moment. "That's how trapping works," he said. "You learn what the animal wants to do, where it wants to walk. Then you put the trap there." She looked at him. "I never thought of it that way." "Most things are the same when you get down to it." It wasn't a profound statement exactly, but it was more than he usually offered, and she found herself turning it over for the rest of the evening. What she told him and what she didn't tell him were not entirely the same thing. She told him the facts of the abandonment, the clearing, the wagon tracks, the arithmetic of what her family had decided she was worth, because she'd already told him the bones of it that first night, and it would have been strange to avoid it now. What she didn't tell him was the interior life of it, the specific quality of standing in that clearing and understanding, in a way that went all the way down to something foundational, that the people who should have been the floor under her feet had simply removed themselves. That was harder to say out loud, not because she was ashamed of it, but because she wasn't sure language could carry it accurately, and she'd rather say nothing than say something imprecise about a thing that precise. He never offered his own equivalent story. The 11 years, the scar, the reason for all of it, that stayed behind whatever wall he maintained, and she kept her promise to herself not to grab for it. But he listened to hers with a steadiness that she'd started to trust, and sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it was more than she'd had anywhere else. The morning Ronan didn't come back on time, she didn't worry immediately. She'd learned the variability of the trap lines. Some days he was back by early afternoon, some days the light was almost gone before his boots hit the porch. She kept the fire going and finished the batch of cornbread she'd been making and fed Rack and waited. The sky had been doing something troubling all morning. She'd watched it through the oilcloth, which she'd lifted one corner of twice to look properly. It had the color she'd learned to mistrust, That low iron gray that wasn't the gray of ordinary cloud cover, but the gray of something with weight behind it. The wind had been building since noon, coming from the northwest, which Ronan had told her once was the direction the worst storms came from. By late afternoon, she was standing at the window watching the tree line and calculating. By the time the light started going, the storm had arrived in earnest. The wind hit the cabin in gusts that made the walls creak and drove the snow horizontally so that looking out the window showed nothing but white movement. The temperature had dropped quickly enough that she could feel it even inside, the cold pressing through the gaps in the logs despite the chinking creeping under the door, making the fire work harder than usual. Rack was at the door. He'd been there for the last hour, which he only did when he was waiting for Ronan. Evelyn fed the fire and tried not to calculate how long a man could last in a blizzard with wind like that. She tried not to think about how she didn't know exactly where the trap lines were. She tried not to think about the fact that if something happened to Ronan out there, the logical steps after that were very short and very bad. She tried to focus on the practical. The fire needed wood. The wood pile on the porch needed to be brought in before the cold made opening the door a larger enterprise. The cornbread needed to be moved off the hot center of the stove before it burned. She did all of these things with the careful deliberateness of someone keeping themselves useful so they don't fall into panic. 2 hours after dark, Rack's head came up. Evelyn was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to move. She heard it a moment after the dog did, a sound that was wrong for the storm, a pattern in the wind that was irregular in the way that human movement is irregular. She grabbed the heavy coat she'd been using, one of Ronan's older ones, enormous on her but warm, and pulled it on and opened the door. The cold hit her like a wall. The wind was extraordinary, the kind that takes your breath before you can use it. She grabbed the door frame and looked out into the dark and the horizontal snow and for a moment saw nothing. Then she saw the shape at the edge of the porch steps. He was moving, which was the first important thing. He was upright mostly, which was the second. But he was moving wrong, listing to one side, one leg not tracking the way it should. And when the wind shifted briefly, she could see that his face was wrong too, tight with something that went past cold into pain. Ronan. She was down the steps before she thought about the ice on them, grabbing his arm. He was heavy, far heavier than he looked, and he was putting almost none of his weight on his right leg. What happened? "Get inside," he said. His voice was rough but controlled. "Can you walk?" "I'm walking." He was, technically. She got his arm over her shoulders, and they went up the steps with him using the railing and her taking as much of his weight as she could manage, which was not as much as she wanted, and her hip immediately registered an opinion about this that she filed away for later. They made it through the door. She kicked it shut behind them. The light inside was a shock after the dark outside. She could see him properly for the first time. His right leg below the knee was dark, not wet dark from snow, dark, dark. "Sit down," she said. "It's not—" "Sit down, Ronan." Something in her voice, she didn't know what exactly, some frequency she hadn't used before, made him sit. He lowered himself to the chair with a controlled care that told her how bad the leg was, because Ronan Creed did not move carefully unless he had very good reason. She crouched in front of him and got her hands on his trouser leg, and he said, "It's not as bad as it looks." She looked up at him. "I'd like to determine that myself." He was quiet. She rolled up the trouser leg, or tried to. The wool was frozen stiff with blood that had soaked through and frozen in the cold. She got her knife out and cut the fabric instead, which was faster. She peeled it away and looked at what was under it. It was, in fact, about as bad as it looked. A branch, broken, jagged, the kind of end you got when a heavy snow load brought down a dead limb without warning, had torn through the flesh of his lower leg, lateral side, about 5 inches above the ankle. The wound was irregular, maybe 4 inches long and deep, shallower at the edges where the bark had skidded, deeper in the center where the point had gone in. It had bled significantly. It was still bleeding, slowly, oozing rather than pumping, which meant it hadn't hit anything major, but it had been bleeding long enough and he'd been in the cold long enough that the blood had frozen in layers over the wound instead of clotting cleanly. She looked at it and thought through what she had and what she needed to do. "When did this happen?" she said. 2 hours ago, maybe more. You walked on this for 2 hours. Didn't have another option." She looked up at him. His face was very controlled, which meant it was costing him something to keep it that way. There was a white edge around his mouth that she recognized from watching people manage serious pain. "I have to clean it," she said, "and close it." "I know. I need the whiskey. Shelf above the door, behind the I'll find it." She stood. "Don't move." The whiskey was where he'd started to say it was, a bottle that was more than half full, which was fortunate. She found the needle and thread, heavier thread than she'd been using for the mending, the kind she'd use for canvas. And she put water on the stove to boil, and she tore 2 of the cleanest rags she could find into strips, and she brought everything back to where he was sitting. She pulled the other chair in front of his and sat and looked at the wound again. Up close, and in the light, it was worse, and her stomach said so in a way she ignored. "This is going to hurt," she said, saying it because he'd said it to her, in the snow, when he'd lifted her, and she understood now why he'd said it. "A lot." "I know that too. Do you want something to bite on?" He looked at her with an expression that was about 30% offended and 70% something else she couldn't name. "Fine," she said. "Hold the chair." She cleaned the wound first. The whiskey went on directly, and he made a sound that was almost nothing, almost completely suppressed. But she felt the muscles in his leg go rigid under her hands, and she pressed harder rather than lighter because stopping partway through was worse than going quickly. "Talk," he said through his teeth. She looked up. "What?" "Talk, say something, anything." She pressed the cloth to the wound and held pressure and talked. She didn't know what she said exactly. Something about the cornbread, about how she'd been rationing the cornmeal and whether they had enough to last, and how she thought the proportion of fat made a difference in how it held together. And she kept her voice as level as she could manage while her hands were doing what they needed to do. And he held the back of the chair with both hands and breathed. When she had it cleaned as well as she could get it, she looked at the edges. They'd want to pull apart. The wound was deep enough and placed in a way that movement would open it if it wasn't closed properly. She'd sutured exactly twice before in her life, once on a dog when she was 16 and once on her own hand 2 years ago when a knife had slipped cutting rope. Both times she'd felt the particular awful intimacy of pushing a needle through flesh, and she'd done it anyway because the alternative was worse. "I have to stitch it," she said. "I figured. I've done it before, not on anything this size, but I know what I'm doing." He looked at her. In the firelight, his face was complicated. Not afraid, because she was starting to believe that whatever Ronan Creed felt, fear wasn't readily available to him, but open in a way she hadn't seen before, like pain had taken down something he usually kept up. "I believe you," he said. She hadn't expected that. She almost asked him to repeat it. Instead, she threaded the needle and started. She worked methodically, the way her mother had taught her to work on difficult fabric, not thinking too far ahead, just the next stitch and the one after that. She pulled the edges together as cleanly as the wound's irregular shape allowed. He didn't make sound. He breathed. She could feel him breathe in the slight rise and fall of his leg under her hands. Occasionally he'd tighten on the chair back, the wood creaking with the force of it, and she'd feel the muscle cord beneath her fingers and wait a beat, and then continue. Rack had placed himself against Ronan's left leg and was leaning there with the steadiness of a dog who understood something was wrong and had made a decision about what to do about it. 12 stitches. She tied off the last one and sat back and looked at what she'd done. It wasn't beautiful. The edges were even enough and the tension was correct and the spacing was functional, but a surgeon it was not. The wound would scar badly, which it would have done anyway, and the scar would sit over a leg that already had an old damage in the knee. "It's done," she said. He looked down at it. He took a long breath through his nose and let it out slowly. "Thank you," he said. His voice was different. Not softer exactly, but the layer had changed, like something close to the surface. She wrapped it tightly in the clean strips of cloth, firm enough to hold pressure, but not so tight it would restrict circulation. Then she stood up, and her legs were unsteady in a way she hadn't permitted herself to notice until just now. And she put one hand on the table and breathed for a moment. "You need to get to the cot," she said. "I'm fine in the chair. The chair is not where you sleep when you have a wound like that. You need to be flat, and you need to be warm." She looked at him. "Don't argue with me about this." Something that might have been amusement crossed his face, barely visible under the exhaustion and the aftermath of pain. "You're different," he said. Different from what? From when I found you. She picked up the bloody rags and the whiskey bottle and the needle and thread. You found me half frozen. Most things would be different from that. That's not what I mean. She stopped and looked at him. He was watching her with an expression she didn't have a category for yet, direct and considering and more present than he usually allowed himself to be. You were frightened before, he said. Not now. She thought about it. I don't have time to be frightened right now. No, he said. That's not it either. She didn't know what to say to that. She set the things down on the shelf and went back to him and got his arm over her shoulders again and walked him to the cot. He was even heavier now, the leg not bearing any weight at all, and she had to use her hip as a brace and let it scream about it. They lowered him down onto the cot with a controlled awkwardness that got the job done without either of them falling. She covered him with the two heaviest furs and put the thinnest piece of extra wood on the fire so it would hold through the night without burning too hot. She pulled the second chair to the side of the cot and sat in it. I'll stay up for a while, she said, in case the fever starts. You don't need to. Ronan. She said his name the way she'd say stop. Let me. He looked at the ceiling. His jaw tightened, the muscle in it moving, and she could see him wrestling with something that was probably not pain exactly, but was close to it. The particular difficulty of a self-sufficient man accepting that tonight he was not self-sufficient. All right, he said. She sat back in the chair. The fire burned. Outside, the blizzard threw itself against the cabin walls with a sound like sustained fury, and the oilcloth windows bowed inward with each gust, and somewhere in the trees a branch gave way with a crack she felt in her chest. Inside, the fire held. Ronan's breathing slowed and evened out as exhaustion overtook pain. Rack climbed onto the cot. She'd never seen him do that before, and she suspected Ronan had a rule about it that was currently being suspended by circumstance, and curled at his feet with a heaviness that said he was staying. Evelyn sat in the chair and watched the fire, and thought about what Ronan had said. You were frightened before, not now. She hadn't realized it herself until he'd named it. She tried to locate the frightened person she'd been in the snow and found she could remember her clearly, could remember the feeling of the cold and the despair and the absolute helpless smallness of it. But that person felt oddly distant, like someone she'd heard about rather than been. She thought about what had changed. It wasn't that the danger was less. The wound on Ronan's leg told its own story about the nature of danger in this place. It wasn't that she was stronger in any simple physical sense, though her hands were rougher now, and her arms had something in them they hadn't had before. It was something else, something that had to do with having been useful, really useful, in a way that mattered. The meals that had kept both of them fed, the clothing she'd repaired that kept them warm, the stitches she'd just put in a man's leg that would, she believed, hold. Being needed was not the same thing as being loved, and she knew the difference, had spent enough of her life confusing the two. But it was something. It was a version of mattering that didn't depend on anyone's approval or anyone's kindness or anyone's decision to keep you around. You could keep yourself around. You could be the reason you were still there. That was what had changed. The fire settled. She added one more piece of wood, small, and banked it carefully. Ronan's breathing was deep and regular. His color was better than it had been when he'd come through the door. The fever, if it was going to come, hadn't arrived yet. She pulled her coat tighter and settled into the chair. The night was very long and the storm was very loud, and she was awake for most of both. But she was awake in the way of someone keeping watch, not in the way of someone afraid of the dark. There was a difference, she'd learned, a significant one. She stayed in the chair until the first gray light came through the oilcloth, and then she got up and put a pot of water on the stove and went to check the wound and found it had held through the night, and she exhaled slowly and let herself believe, carefully and without celebration, that maybe he was going to be all right. Maybe they both were. The fever came on the second day. She'd been watching for it, checking his forehead every few hours the way her mother used to check bread dough, pressing the back of her hand to his skin and reading what was there. The first morning after the injury it was normal, or close to it, and she'd let herself think maybe they'd gotten lucky. By the second evening his skin was dry and hot in a way that wasn't good, and by the middle of that night he was sweating through the furs, and his breathing had changed from the deep regular sleep of the night before to something shallower and more effortful. She kept cold compresses on his forehead through the night, rinsing the cloth in the water she kept in the tin basin, wringing it out, pressing it back. It was tedious work, and it was probably only partially effective, and she did it anyway because it was the thing she could do. She changed the bandage on the leg, and the wound looked as it should, angry and swollen, but no red lines spreading out from it, no smell that would mean infection had taken hold properly. That was something. That was the most important something. Ronan was not a good patient. She would not have expected him to be. In the first full day of fever, he was mostly out, sleeping heavily, surfacing occasionally into a half-consciousness that wasn't really wakefulness, saying things that were fragments of thoughts she couldn't assemble into anything coherent. A name once, maybe two names, she couldn't tell. Something about a river. Something she didn't catch. She didn't try to respond to any of it, just kept the cloth cold and the fire steady and the leg elevated on a folded fur. On the second day of fever, he was awake more, which was both better and worse. Better because it meant the fever wasn't taking him under. Worse because a semi-conscious Ronan Creed was still mostly Ronan Creed, and Ronan Creed did not like lying on his back being tended to. "I need to check the north line," he said, the first coherent thing he said that second morning. She was at the stove. She turned and looked at him. "No. There's a beaver set up there that... Ronan, you have a hole in your leg that I stitched closed 40 hours ago. You have a fever. You're not going anywhere." He looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man revising his next argument. "The traps need running," he said. "The traps will keep. The animals won't. If something's caught and it sits too long in this cold, then it sits." She brought a cup of water to the side of the cot and held it out. "Drink this." He looked at the cup. He looked at her. He drank the water with the particular energy of a man doing something under protest and wanting that to be known. "You're stubborn," he said. "Learned it from someone," she said. He was quiet. She thought he almost smiled. The fever broke on the third day, the way fevers do. Suddenly and messily, with a night of heavy sweating that soaked through everything and left him pale and wrung out in the morning, but with clear eyes for the first time since the branch had taken him down. She changed the bedding and the bandage and made broth from the last of the dried venison, thin and not very good, and he drank all of it. "How much meat do we have left?" he said. Not a question exactly. She'd been waiting for this conversation. "Not much." "How much?" "Enough for maybe 10 days, if I'm careful. Less if the cold stays this hard, and we need to eat more to keep warm." He was quiet, working through the same arithmetic she'd already worked through. His face was doing the calculating thing, slow and thorough. "I need to get back on the lines," he said. "Your leg, I know what my leg is. How long until I can walk on it properly?" She thought about the wound honestly. 2 weeks before you should be putting full weight on it. 10 days minimum before you try anything beyond the cabin. "We don't have 2 weeks of food." "I know that." They looked at each other. "I can go out," she said, "to the woodpile, to the porch. I've been managing that." "The trap lines aren't the porch. You don't know where they are, and you can't check a trap correctly without—" "I know I can't run your trap lines." She kept her voice even. "I'm not suggesting that. I'm trying to think about what we actually have to work with." Another silence. This was one of the things she'd come to understand about him. That silence wasn't empty. It was processing, and interrupting it was counterproductive. "There's a snare set up," he said finally, 50 yards northeast of the cabin, in the draw between the two big spruce. Simple trigger. You'd be able to reset it. Rabbits use that draw consistently. "Show me which direction." "From the porch. The taller of the two spruces is visible when the snow's not too heavy. The draw runs along the base of it." "All right." "And there's dried fish. In the tin under the second shelf, the flat one. I forgot about it. Not much, but it's there." She went and found the tin immediately. Inside were 6 pieces of dried fish, hard and dark and smelling strongly. Not much, but she revised her food calculation upward by 4 or 5 days and felt the relief of it physically. "That helps," she said. He let out a slow breath. "Evelyn?" She looked at him. He used her name rarely enough that it still registered when he did. "I'm not going to tell you what to do if something happens to me," he said. "You know what you'd need to do. Nothing's going to happen to you." "That's not—" "I know what you're saying." She set the tin on the table. And I'm choosing not to have that conversation today. Today you have a fever that just broke and you need to eat something and rest, and I'm going to check the snare and the draw, and we're going to deal with what's actually in front of us right now instead of the worst version of what might be in front of us. He looked at her for a long moment. Fine, he said. Good. She went to the snare that afternoon in a break between snowfalls when the visibility was decent. She found the draw where he'd described it and the snare where he'd told her it would be. Empty, but undisturbed, the trigger intact. She reset it more firmly, the way he'd shown her on a small piece of rope one slow afternoon 3 weeks back, when they'd been talking about nothing much, and he'd demonstrated it without making a lesson of it. She reset 2 more she found nearby that she almost missed, barely visible under a thin coating of new snow. She came back to the cabin cold and tired, and with nothing to show for it, and he was awake on the cot and looked at her when she came in with the same question in his face that she had in her own. Empty, she said. But I reset them. Maybe tomorrow. He nodded. He didn't say anything about the fact that she'd been out alone, navigating snow and terrain on a bad hip, which she'd half expected him to comment on. He seemed to have accepted, somewhere in the days of the fever, that his position relative to Evelyn's capability had shifted. She wasn't sure exactly when it had happened, not in a single moment. More the way snow accumulates, imperceptibly, and then suddenly there's more of it than you realized. The snare was empty for 3 days. She checked it every morning, working it into the shape of her day, and every morning she came back with nothing and revised the food situation in her head and kept it to herself because there was nothing useful to be done with worry except let it eat you. Ronan was healing, or healing as much as Ronan was going to allow himself to heal, which meant he was upright and moving around the cabin by day 4 post-fever despite everything she said about it. The leg held his weight with what she could see was significant pain, but it held, and the wound when she changed the bandage was closing properly, the edges knitting together with a solidity that meant the stitching had done its job. It's going to be a bad scar, she said, the 6th time she changed the dressing. I have others? She'd noticed. She didn't comment. The stitching's good, he said. He said it to the ceiling, not to her, in the tone of someone reporting a factual observation. It's functional, she said. It's not pretty. Doesn't need to be pretty. She finished wrapping it and sat back. How's the pain? Manageable, which meant considerable. She'd learned his scale. I'm going to check the snare, she said. I'll come. She looked at him. Ronan, I know the area better than you. If we need to move the set, I can read the signs faster. She wanted to argue and recognized that he was right, which made arguing harder. You use the staff, she said, meaning the thick branch she'd cut and smoothed for him while he was down, something between a walking stick and a crutch. Fine. They went out together, which was the first time she'd been outside with him since the night he'd come through the door trailing blood. The cold was extraordinary, the kind that existed in a different category from ordinary cold. It had texture to it, weight, and almost physical presence. The snow was deep and crusted from a freeze-thaw cycle that had left the surface just strong enough to suggest it would hold your weight and just weak enough to be wrong about half the time. Ronan moved slowly but steadily, the staff taking the weight his leg couldn't. She matched his pace, which was easier than her own would have been. Her hip liked even surfaces, which did not describe deep-crusted snow in any way. The draw was empty again. She watched him crouch, carefully, favoring the leg, and examined the snow around the snare with the concentrated attention he gave to things he was reading rather than just looking at. He touched the snow in 2 places, examined the trigger, looked at the surrounding trees. Move it, he said. 10 feet north. There's a run here. He pointed, and she looked and saw nothing. You can see where they've been traveling along the base of that blowdown. The snare's set in the wrong place. I didn't see the run. It's subtle. The snow's just slightly disturbed. They're moving at night when it's coldest. He straightened slowly. Move it there. Keep the trigger sensitive. She did it while he watched, and he said nothing, which she understood to mean she was doing it right. They were heading back when Rack, who had come with them and been ranging out ahead, suddenly stopped. The dog went rigid. Not the alert but casual posture of scenting something interesting, but the full-body stillness of an animal that has identified a specific threat. His head was up and his gaze was fixed on the tree line to the west, and a low sound started in his chest, that she'd never heard from him before. She stopped. Ronan stopped. "How far back is the rifle?" he said quietly. He'd left it on the porch, which now felt like a significant decision. 60 yards. She said it the same way. Quiet. They heard them before they saw them. A sound that was technically like dogs, but wasn't. A series of short, high vocalizations that moved through the trees and came from more than one direction. Rack's growl deepened. "Walk back," Ronan said. "Don't run." "I know." They turned and walked. Not fast, not slow. The deliberate pace of people who understood that running triggered pursuit and that the cabin was not far enough away to make running viable anyway. She could hear Ronan's breathing change, the leg costing him more on the return than it had on the way out. And she moved slightly closer to his left side without making a production of it. She saw the first one at the tree line, gray and thin in a way that meant real hunger, not the healthy leanness of a wolf in good country. It was watching them with the focused, patient attention of an animal that had been following them for longer than they'd known. There were 3 more that she could see. Probably more she couldn't. "Rack," Ronan said, his voice low and flat. The dog came immediately to his side. Smart dog, she thought. This was not a fight Rack could win. The cabin porch was 30 yards away. 20. The wolves had come to the edge of the trees and stopped, which wasn't reassuring. It meant they were close enough to think about it. 15 yards. The lead wolf moved. Not a full charge, a testing movement, angling toward Ronan's right side where the staff and the limp made him look like the weaker target. She saw it happen and turned toward it and shouted, not words, just sound, loud and sharp, and as aggressive as she could make it. And the wolf checked, startled, pulling back. 10 yards to the porch. She got there first and had the rifle off the wall and back through the door in under 10 seconds, and Ronan came through with Rack at his heels, and she put her shoulder against the door, and they got it closed. For a moment they both stood there. Her heart was going very fast. She was aware of this the way you're aware of weather, as a fact occurring in your vicinity that you can observe but not particularly control. You shouted at it, Ronan said. It worked. It worked, he agreed. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to think of as his version of respect, which didn't look like other people's versions, but was unmistakable once you knew what you were looking for. She was already at the window, lifting the corner of the oilcloth. The wolves were at the edge of the clearing, visible in the dim gray light. 5 of them. She counted twice. 5. And all of them with the same gaunt, angular look of animals that had been moving through bad country in a bad winter with not enough to eat. They'll come back, she said. Yes. Tonight, probably. Or they'll wait and watch. Yes. He moved to stand next to her at the window, looking out. They've probably been following the cabin smell for days. We've been burning the bones and scraps in the stove, but this cold carries scent differently. She thought about this. She thought about the snare in the draw and how far from the cabin it was, and what going back to check it in the morning would look like with a wolf pack that had now identified them as prey adjacent. We have to solve 2 problems, she said. The wolves and the food. If we solve one, we solve both. He said it quietly, looking out at the clearing. She understood what he meant. She looked at the wolves in the tree line and thought about the meat on them and felt the particular ugliness of necessity. Can you shoot left-handed? She said. The wound was on his right leg, but she was thinking about standing position, about the stability of a compromised stance. I can shoot. It won't be my best shooting. It doesn't need to be your best. It needs to hit the lead animal. She looked at him. The others will break if the leader goes down. Pack logic. He looked back at her. You know about wolves. I know about groups, she said. It's not so different. He was quiet for a moment, then. In the morning, first light, when they're most likely to push. Better visibility. All right. She let the oilcloth fall back over the window. The cabin was very small around them, the space between them about 2 feet, both of them standing at the window in the low firelight. She could feel the cold coming off his coat from the time they'd been outside. I'm sorry, he said. She looked at him. For what? For going down, for putting us in this situation. He said it the way he said most things, directly without softening. But there was something underneath it that cost him more than the words suggested. You didn't plan to get hit by a tree limb. I should have been watching better. Ronan, she turned toward him. You carried me out of a blizzard. You fed me and kept me alive and didn't ask for anything in return. You don't get to apologize for getting hurt." He looked at her steadily. The firelight moved across his face, and she could see the exhaustion in it, and the pain from the leg, and the particular heaviness of a man who'd been alone so long that being indebted to someone was a weight he didn't know how to carry. "You stitched me back together," he said. "Yes." "You sat up all night for 3 nights." "Yes." "Why?" The question seemed genuine, which made it the strangest question she'd been asked in a long time. She thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. "Because you're still alive," she said, "and I'd like you to stay that way." He didn't say anything. She went back to the stove and put more water on and pretended to be very focused on that for a minute. The next morning came gray and still, the strange hush that preceded movement. She was awake before dawn, had been awake most of the night, and when the light began coming through the oilcloth, she lifted the corner and looked out. The lead wolf was in the clearing. Alone in front, the others spread behind it in the trees. It was looking directly at the cabin with the calm, measuring look of something that had made a decision. Ronan. He was already up. She hadn't heard him move. He took the rifle from where she held it out and checked it with the quick, automatic movements of long practice, then came to stand at the window. "Open it," he said. 2 inches. She opened the window covering 2 inches, and cold air poured in immediately, and somewhere outside a bird went silent. The lead wolf's head came up. Ronan steadied the rifle against the window frame. His right leg was taking minimal weight, the left doing most of the work, and she could see the adjustment in how he held his body, compensating for what the leg couldn't give him. His breathing slowed. She didn't breathe at all. The shot was loud in the morning stillness, a single hard crack that echoed off the trees and came back changed. The lead wolf dropped. The others broke instantly, scattering into the trees with a speed that was almost impressive. And then they were gone. The clearing empty except for the gray shape in the snow and the echo of the shot fading into the mountain quiet. She exhaled. Ronan lowered the rifle. He stood at the open window looking out at the clearing with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not satisfaction, not quite. Something more complicated than that. "Good shot," she said. "It was a close shot. It was a good shot." He looked at her sideways. Then he looked back out at the clearing and what lay there, and she understood the complication in his expression because she felt it too. The specific weight of having killed something because you needed to eat, the transaction that had no comfortable way to be felt. "I'll go out first," he said. "Together," she said. "Like last time." He looked at her, and whatever argument he'd been assembling, he put down again. Together they went out into the cold morning, and together they dragged the wolf back to the cabin, which was hard and awkward, and neither of them talked much while they did it. Her hip screamed. His leg did whatever his version of screaming was, which was a locked jaw and very controlled breathing. They got it done. That night she cooked what she could from the animal and set the rest to freeze in the cold of the porch, which was more reliable than any ice house. The meat was lean and strong-flavored and not particularly good, and they both ate it without complaint because it was the difference between the arithmetic working and not working, and both of them were past the point of needing food to be pleasant. She ate across the table from him, and he ate across from her, and Rack sat between them receiving pieces that came from both sides, which was something she didn't point out, and neither did he. Outside the mountain was quiet. The wolves didn't come back that night, or the next night. The snare and the draw caught 2 rabbits in the following week, and Ronan was back on limited trapline duty within 10 days, moving slowly and not going far, but bringing back enough to keep them going. The crisis had passed. Not the winter. The winter still had weeks left in it, and the food situation still required careful management, and the leg was going to need watching for longer than Ronan was going to admit. But the specific, acute crisis of those days had passed, and what was left behind it was different from what had been there before. She couldn't have said exactly what was different, only that when she looked across the cabin at him in the evenings now, something had settled between them that hadn't been there before. Not comfortable exactly, because neither of them was built for comfortable, but solid. The way a good stitch is solid, not beautiful, but holding. It had taken near disaster to show them what they'd built, but it was built, and it was holding. Spring didn't arrive the way people who hadn't wintered in the mountains might imagine it. It didn't come as a morning when you woke up and the world was suddenly soft and green and forgiving. It came in arguments. A warm afternoon followed by 2 days of hard freeze, a week of melt that softened the snow to slush, and then an overnight cold that turned the slush to ice that made the porch steps lethal. It came in the sound of water moving under the snowpack before any water was visible. It came in the way the light changed, almost imperceptibly at first, just a quality of the afternoon sun that was different from January's thin, watery gray, something with a little more intention in it. Evelyn noticed it first in Rack. The dog started spending more time at the door, not in the watchful way he'd done during the worst of winter, but with a restlessness that was pointed outward rather than inward. He wanted to range. He wanted to move through a world that was larger than the cabin's clearing and the established perimeter Ronan had been limiting him to through the worst months. She understood the feeling. The leg had healed well enough, which was to say it had healed imperfectly in the way that wounds in the back of nowhere heal, with a scar that pulled when the weather changed and a stiffness in the mornings that Ronan managed with movement rather than complaint, walking it out on the porch and back until the tissue loosened. He didn't talk about it. She didn't ask. They had both, by this point, developed a fluency in the other's silences that made a great deal of conversation unnecessary. What filled the late winter and early spring was work, the kind of work that had nothing to do with immediate survival, longer horizon work, the planning kind. Ronan had begun the process of preparing his spring pelts for sale, and she'd taken on the task of maintaining the records he kept, such as they were, in a battered ledger that lived on the highest shelf. His records were functional but not particularly organized, the notation system of a man who'd kept them primarily for his own reference, and never imagined anyone else would need to read them. She reorganized without being asked and explained the new system to him once, and he looked at it and said, "That's better," and went back to work. And that was the whole of that conversation. She also began in the afternoons when the light lasted long enough to inventory the cabin seriously. Not the survival inventory she'd done in the first weeks, counting what they had and calculating how long it would last, but a longer-term assessment of what the cabin needed and what was possible. The chinking between the north-facing logs had deteriorated and needed to be redone before next winter. The porch steps second from the top had been rotting since probably before she'd arrived and would become genuinely dangerous in the thaw. The woodpile was lower than it should be for a full year of comfortable use, which meant spring cutting would need to start early. She wrote it down in the margins of a piece of paper she'd found in the ledger. She didn't show it to Ronan. She told herself she was doing it out of habit, the habit of a person who managed things by understanding them fully. She didn't examine that reasoning too carefully. The conversation she'd been not having with herself all winter became harder to avoid in March, when the melt started in earnest and the world beyond the cabin began to reappear from under the snow. The creek she could hear but not see all winter became visible again, first as dark water at the edges of ice, and then as a proper running creek, cold and fast with snowmelt. The mountains above the tree line showed themselves. She'd known abstractly that they were there, but now she could see them, white and enormous, against a sky that was starting to hold actual blue some afternoons. The pass would open. Not for weeks, probably, but it would open. And when it opened, she had an arrangement to honor. In spring, you leave. She hadn't forgotten it. She'd simply put it in a part of her mind that she wasn't visiting regularly, the way you avoid a room in a house where something uncomfortable is stored. But March brought it back with the same reliability that it brought back the creek and the mountain view. Things that had been there all along, just temporarily obscured. She was awake earlier than usual on a morning in late March, the fire already going, sitting at the table with her hands around a cup of coffee. Real coffee, which Ronan had produced from a small tin she hadn't known about, appearing one morning with an expression that was as close to conspiratorial as his face was capable of getting. She was thinking, not particularly productively, about what came next. She had no home to return to. She had no family, not in any functional sense, not anymore. She had no money and no property and no particular destination. She'd come through that pass with a family who hadn't wanted her, and she'd survived the winter with a man who very much hadn't wanted her originally and had nevertheless kept her alive. And in the spring, she was supposed to simply choose a direction and walk in it. She was trying to determine how she felt about this when Ronan came in from checking the morning. He was moving better than he had in months, the leg finally behaving closer to how a leg should behave. He came to the stove and poured coffee, and then, instead of going to his chair or to the work table, he stayed standing at the stove with his back to her for an unusual length of time. She waited. "There's going to be a wagon train through," he said, eventually, to the wall above the stove. "Month and a half, maybe 2 months. They come through the lower pass in late May most years. I go down and trade the season's pelts. There's a trading post at the junction." "All right," she said. "You could join them." He turned slightly, not facing her but no longer fully turned away. "I have gold set aside. From good years. You could take enough to get yourself set up somewhere. A town. Portland's grown considerably. Sacramento. Somewhere with more than this." She looked at him. He was looking at the middle distance, at nothing specific, with the carefully neutral expression he wore when he was saying something that cost him more than the words themselves. She understood then that he'd been holding this for a while, that he'd been preparing this for her. The plan, the gold, the sensible transition, the way you prepare something for someone when you've decided their well-being matters to you more than your preference for the outcome. "How much gold?" she said. Something shifted in his jaw. "Enough. That's not an amount. Enough to start over, comfortably." He finally turned and looked at her. "You deserve a better situation than this. A real house. A town. People." She looked down at her coffee cup. She thought about Portland. She thought about Sacramento. She thought about towns with proper buildings and shops and people who didn't communicate primarily through meaningful silence. She tried to picture herself in one of those places, arriving with enough gold to be respectable, starting whatever came next. The picture didn't take hold the way she expected it to. "You want me to go?" she said. "I want—" He stopped, started again. "What I want isn't the relevant question. It's one of them." He was quiet. She put her cup down and looked at him directly in the way she'd learned he was capable of tolerating, which was more directly than most people expected. "Ronan, do you want me to go?" The silence that followed was not the working silence or the eating silence. It was the third kind, the one she'd started to recognize in the evenings, the one that felt like presence more than absence. It went on long enough that a log shifted in the fire, and Rack raised his head from the floor and then lowered it again. "No," Ronan said. He said it the way he said things that were true and uncomfortable, and that he'd clearly argued with himself about before saying, "No, I don't want you to go. But what I want doesn't—" "Stop saying that." She stood up from the table. Not dramatically, just stood because she needed to be standing for this. "I've spent my whole life around people who told me that what they needed mattered more than what I needed and what I could offer and who I was. My stepmother told my father that I was a liability, and my father, who I believed loved me, decided that was an arithmetic he could live with." Her voice stayed even. She'd made peace with the fact of it, not with the feeling of it, but she could manage the fact. "I'm not doing that again. I'm not letting someone else decide what I'm worth and where I belong." He looked at her. "So I'm asking you directly," she said. "Do you want me to stay?" Another silence, shorter this time. "Yes," he said. "Then say so. Don't pack my bag and hand me gold and make the decision for me because you've decided you're not worth staying for." That landed. She could see it land. A small tightening around his eyes, a fractional shift in how he was standing. She hadn't meant it as a weapon exactly, but she'd meant it as true, and it was true, and she wasn't going to unsay it. "It's not a small thing," he said, "staying here. It's a hard life. It doesn't get easier. I know that. I've been living it for 4 months. A hard life gets harder when—" He stopped. "When what?" He looked at her with the expression she'd seen a handful of times, the one that appeared when he'd come as close to the surface of himself as he usually allowed and then stopped, because going further was territory he didn't have easy access to. The scar on his neck, the 11 years, the things she'd never asked about. She waited. "When you care about whether someone's all right," he said, "it gets harder when that's involved." She understood what that sentence had cost him, and she didn't treat it cheaply. She let it sit for a moment in the air between them. "I know," she said more quietly. "I know it does." He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the window, where the morning light was coming in real and pale gold through the oilcloth. He looked at his hands, briefly, then back at her. The chinking on the north wall needs redoing, he said. She blinked. I know. I have it on a list. And the step. Second from the top. I've known about that since February. I was thinking, he said slowly, like a man feeling his way along unfamiliar ground. We could add another room. Not large. The back wall's sound and the timber's available if I start cutting in April. He paused. More space would help. She looked at him. At this man with his scarred neck and his rebuilt knee and his 11 years of deliberate solitude and his complete inability to say any of the things he actually meant in any direct way. She felt something warm move through her chest, and she didn't try to name it or manage it. She just let it be there. It would help, she agreed. We should also think about a proper root cellar before next fall. The cold storage situation is manageable, but it's not good. There's a spot on the east side that would work. Ground's not too rocky. I'll add it to the list. He nodded. He took his coffee to the table and sat down. She sat down across from him. They drank their coffee in the quiet that was not silence exactly. Never exactly silence. With the creak now audible and the birds starting to return to the timber and Rack's occasional movement on the floor. But a quiet that had ease in it. The kind of quiet that belongs to people who have been through something together that neither of them would have survived alone, and who have stopped pretending otherwise. 6 weeks later, the wagon train came through the lower pass. Evelyn stood on the porch and watched the line of canvas-topped wagons move through the valley below, small with distance, their pace unhurried in the warm spring air. There were a lot of them, a good-sized train, maybe 20 wagons, with the dust cloud that meant dry ground, which meant real spring had arrived and was staying this time. She'd known it was coming. Ronan had traded word with a trapper he'd seen on the South Line last week, who'd passed along that the train was 2 days out. He'd come home and told her in the matter-of-fact way he communicated things, and then gone back to work on the addition, which was framed now and waiting on the roofing material he'd be getting from the trading post. She watched the wagons for a while. Rack sat beside her, leaning against her leg in the way he'd started doing sometime in February, which still made her feel obscurely honored. She thought about the wagons. She thought about the people in them, where they were going, what they were hoping to find. She thought about herself, 4.5 months ago, in a wagon moving through a mountain pass, believing that the people on the seat ahead of her were the fixed point around which her life was organized. She thought about her father. She'd done this less as the winter progressed, not because it hurt less, but because she'd gotten more honest with herself about the geography of it. He'd loved her. She still believed that, and she believed it had cost him something to do what he'd done, and she believed he'd spent the winter with that cost. But love and choice were separate things, and he'd made his choice, and she'd been building her life in the aftermath of it, the way you build a house after a flood, using whatever materials are still sound, putting them together differently than before. She wasn't the same person who'd gone for firewood in November. She'd noticed this in small ways all winter, and she noticed it now, watching the wagons. The woman in November had been waiting, she understood this in retrospect, waiting for someone to tell her where she was supposed to be and who she was supposed to be to them. Waiting to matter to someone on terms they set, in a role they defined for her. She'd stopped waiting sometime between the wolf and the spring thaw. She wasn't sure exactly when, only that she'd looked up one morning and found she wasn't doing it anymore. Ronan came out of this tree line at the edge of the clearing, carrying timber across one shoulder with the particular rolling gait of a man who'd been doing this for decades and had learned how to make a heavy load work with his body rather than against it. He walked up to the porch and set the timber down and straightened and followed her line of sight to the valley below. They watched the wagons for a moment together. "You should go down," she said. "Trade the pelts. Get the roofing material and whatever else we need." "We'll both go," he said. "You need boots. Those ones won't last another winter." She looked down at her boots, which had been resoled twice now, and were held together in 3 places with rawhide and determination. "I've been meaning to mention those." "I know, you didn't want to add to the list." She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was still looking at the wagons, but the corner of his mouth had moved. "I'll add them now," she said. They went down to the trading post 2 days later, taking the mule. Ronan had a mule, she'd learned, kept at a small lean-to shelter a 1/4 mile from the cabin. One of many things about the property she was still discovering, and the sled loaded with the season's pelts. The trading post was small and crowded with wagon train traffic. smelling of unwashed people and tobacco and fresh-cut lumber, and it was the most noise and the most human density she'd experienced since November. She found it overwhelming for about 20 minutes, and then she found her footing. She negotiated the price of the pelts herself, which surprised the trader and didn't surprise Ronan, who stood slightly back and let it happen. She got a better price than the trader's first offer and a fair price on the boots she chose, which were better quality than she'd expected to find out here. And she said so, and the trader seemed pleased to be recognized for something other than his location. She bought coffee, real coffee, the good kind. She bought cornmeal and flour and salt and an amount of dried fruit that was modest but meaningful. She bought the roofing material, and on an instinct she didn't second guess, a small pane of actual glass to replace the oilcloth in the window. It was expensive, and she'd used what Ronan had told her she could spend, and she didn't regret it for a moment. As they were loading the sled, a woman from the wagon train approached her. She was maybe 40, with the trail-weathered look of someone who'd been moving for months and had made peace with it. "You're not with the train," the woman said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," Evelyn said. "I live up the mountain." The woman glanced at Ronan, loading timber onto the sled with the systematic efficiency that was just how he moved through work, then back at Evelyn. "Been here long?" "Since November." "Through the whole winter?" A pause. "Alone?" "Not alone," Evelyn said. The woman looked at her with the evaluating look of someone who was wondering about the shape of her situation and whether to ask further. "It's a hard country," the woman said finally. "It is," Evelyn agreed. "It's also mine." She hadn't planned to say it. It came out with the simple certainty of something she'd known without knowing she knew it, and she stood with it for a moment after it left her mouth, testing it. It was true. The mountain and the timber and the cold and the particular quality of the air up there, the creek and the cabin and the morning light through the oilcloth and now, soon, through glass. It was hers in a way that was different from ownership. It was hers because she'd bled for it, in the particular way of a person who nearly dies somewhere and then chooses to stay, because nothing is truly yours until you've paid for it in something real. The woman nodded as if she understood this and moved back toward her wagon. Ronan appeared at Evelyn's shoulder. He'd heard the last part, she thought, or enough of it. "Ready?" he said. "Yes." They loaded the last of it and turned the mule back toward the mountain. The ride up was long, and she was tired from the noise of the trading post, and she let herself be tired without fighting it, swaying slightly with the motion of the sled, watching the valley fall away behind them and the timber close back in around the track. The afternoon light was doing something particular to the mountains above, turning the snow on the high peaks to something between pink and gold, the kind of color that only exists for about 20 minutes around this time of year in the late afternoon. She'd noticed it all winter but hadn't had anyone to mention it to, or it hadn't seemed worth mentioning. Now she said, "The light on those peaks." Ronan looked, held on it for a moment. "March is better," he said. "Sometimes in March, when the clouds are a certain way, it goes red." "Real red?" "Real red. You'll see it." She looked at him. "Next March." He was talking about next March, naturally, without making a point of it. The way you mention a seasonal thing to someone who's going to be there for the season. The way you share the calendar of a place with someone who belongs to it. She faced forward again. "I want a garden," she said, "on the south side of the cabin. The sun's good there in the afternoon. We could have vegetables by midsummer." "Ground's hard to break up there." "I know, I'll start now and work it in pieces." A pause. "I'll help." She nodded. "You can help." The cabin came into view through the trees as the light was going, the stone chimney first and then the walls, the framed addition open to the sky, waiting on its roof. Rack was on the porch, having preceded them back by a considerable margin, watching their approach with his yellow eyes and his expression of complete neutrality. She got down from the sled, and her new boots hit the ground solidly, and her bad hip said something mild about the long day, and she told it she'd sit down soon. She stood and looked at the cabin. Rough, small, in need of significant work in more places than the list she'd been keeping. Not the cabin of someone who'd ever had enough help or enough time or enough of anything except determination. Her family had calculated on a November morning that she was a cost they couldn't carry. They'd looked at her bad leg and her full weight in the wagon, and they'd run their numbers and decided the math didn't work. What they hadn't calculated was what she'd become without them. And this, she thought, was the thing nobody told you about being thrown away by the people who should have kept you. That sometimes, in the specific conditions of the right kind of hardship, with the right kind of person standing nearby, being thrown away is the thing that finally teaches you what you're made of. You find out that you can stitch a wound in a man's leg with your hands shaking and get it right. That you can shoot at a wolf with borrowed courage and make it land. That you can build a life from the raw material of being unwanted if you're willing to put in the work. Being discarded doesn't define you. How you build after it does. She wasn't grateful for what her family had done. She wasn't going to perform gratitude for pain that was real and had cost her real things. But she was standing on a mountain in spring boots with a list of improvements for a cabin that was hers in all the ways that mattered, next to a man who'd said yes when it counted, and she was going to break ground on a garden tomorrow morning. And the light on those peaks was doing something extraordinary, and she was alive in a way that had nothing to do with merely surviving. Ronan had unhitched the mule and was carrying the first load inside. He paused in the doorway and looked back at her still standing in the clearing. "You coming in?" "In a minute." He looked at her the way he sometimes looked at things he was trying to understand, not impatiently, just fully. Then he went inside and left her to her minute, because that was what he did, and she'd long since understood that it was one of the most important things about him. She stood in the clearing in the last light and let it be everything it was. Cold still, in the shade of the trees. The creek running somewhere below, the sound of it clean and constant. The mountains holding their last hour of color above the timber. Then she turned and walked inside, and she pulled the door shut behind her, and the fire was going and the coffee was on, and she sat down and took off her new boots and began to read through the list of what came next. There was a great deal on it. She was already looking forward to all of it,